YouTube, once again, it's Kennard Vernon Stewart here for Vernon Speaks Sports Auburn, and we're doing our 2019 opponent previews. Like I said before, here on this channel, college football is king. And on the loveliest village on the plains in central Alabama, the battle cry is War Eagle. Let's go ahead and get the comment section active as we're talking about some Auburn football today. And we've already done some previews on Oregon, Kent State, Tulane, and Texas A&M. This will actually be the second SEC game for the Auburn Tigers. Typically, Auburn plays against Mississippi State during the earlier portion of the period. It's usually not a game that's played during the very difficult stretch, but it usually serves as a litmus test as to how the outcome of the season will be for the Auburn Tigers. In recent history, we date back to 2013, where we kind of didn't know where Auburn stood as a football team that particular year. Some last-minute heroics from Nick Marshall passed to C.J. Uzomah within the closing seconds of that particular football game led to the start of what happened in 2013, as Auburn did take the loss to LSU, but subsequently went on a very unlikely run all the way to the college football national championship game against Florida State. Current Texas A&M coach Jimbo Fisher was at Florida State at Florida State at the time. Auburn also SEC champions that particular year as well. So I wouldn't say that Mississippi State is a huge rivalry for Auburn, but see, if you think about the Mississippi State game, it's usually an early SEC game. As a matter of fact, if you look at the schedule, at least within the Gus Malzahn era, and probably even before that, usually Mississippi, at the latest, Auburn plays Mississippi State no later than the first week of October. Last year, we talk about the Mississippi State game, we'll even go back to 2014. Auburn and Mississippi State met in a very high consequence game. I want to say that was the highest rank that both teams had coming into that game playing against one another. Mississippi State riding a very huge wave coming into that particular game. It was a home game, an obvious trap game for the Auburn Tigers. Auburn made a lot of mistakes in that game. Had a chance to come back, but continued to make costly mistakes. Mississippi State won that game in 2014, 38-23. Also, you talk about the 2015 game when Auburn was really struggling, with the quarterback position, really trying to find some solidarity on both sides of the football field. Jeremy Johnson loses his starting role, marks the debut, so to speak, of Sean White. Sean White in the first drive throws an interception on their way to a 17-9 loss to Mississippi State. Now, here's the thing. When I look at this game against Mississippi State, the reason why this game is so pivotal is this is usually the litmus test SEC-wise for the Auburn Tigers. If you look at the results, whenever Auburn loses to Mississippi State, that is usually followed up with these 8-5 years, 7-6 years that we talk about. And the reason why that is the case is because typically, even though we don't want to discount Mississippi State as a force in the SEC West, but traditionally they've just kind of been in that middle tier SEC-wise. And if you really look at it, Auburn is a team that should beat Mississippi State year in and year out because Auburn typically recruits better than Mississippi State, has better access, usually has a better roster than Mississippi State. So when Auburn loses to Mississippi State in the manner that they have, that usually signifies a very, very bad spot for the Auburn Tigers moving forward, because you talk about the losses in 2014, 2015. What happens? Auburn winds up being 8-5. You talk about the loss even in 2018. Auburn winds up being 8-5 or, something mediocre of that nature, because these are the games. Mississippi State usually signifies a winnable game for Auburn. And since Auburn plays Mississippi State so early in the season, a loss to Mississippi State usually turns into a very detrimental thing, because it's a mental thing. It's a mental thing, and it's a very, very catastrophic loss for Auburn, because usually Auburn will have either already played an SEC team, or Mississippi State will be either their first or second SEC team on the schedule. And like I said before, using this year as an example, Auburn has to take the trip down to Texas A&M, which will be a very, very tough trip for the Auburn Tigers, having to face what we think is an improved Kellen Mond, and a very tough environment for the most part for the Auburn Tigers, to play down in College Station, and then to follow that up with a home game against Mississippi State. The Mississippi State game is going to be very crucial. Now, looking at the Auburn roster, I believe that, this year, Auburn has the opportunity for the first time in a very long time, I would even go out on a limb and say since 2004, to be very, very deep in the very key areas of play. Now, mind you, I think there's some question marks at the offensive line still for the Auburn Tigers, because of recruiting efforts over the past few years. Didn't really stock up on offensive linemen the way that you would have liked. But at the same time, you bring a veteran offensive line back coming into the Mississippi State game. You talk about the experience that Auburn has. I really believe that this is a game that Auburn should win. And, just really, really talking about it, this is a game they need to win, because this starts the stretch between Texas A&M and LSU. That is going to be the most crucial stretch of the season. Now, my buddy Josh Pate with the Late Kick, he did a segment on Georgia's schedule. This is, Georgia has a very, very difficult late stretch, in my opinion. You talk about from the Florida game on is probably going to be one of the toughest in college football. That stretch is similar to where Auburn's stretch will be during the Texas A&M, Mississippi State stretch, Florida, LSU. That's the brutal stretch for Auburn. And then, of course, you got to talk about Georgia and Alabama for Auburn. But this is where the solidification of where Auburn will go, where that will begin. Of course, I think that because, Auburn has one of the more experienced rosters that they've had in quite some time. You talk about the solidarity at the defensive line. I don't see any reason why Auburn should, lose to Mississippi State. I think it would be an absolutely it will be one of those Gus Malzahn unnecessary losses. When I think about 2014, I think Auburn had the better team against Mississippi State. Just an unnecessary loss. In 2015, even with Auburn falling apart somewhat at the seams, still should have beat Mississippi State. And of course, 2016, 2017, Auburn pretty much owned Mississippi State. Then come 2018, at the heels of beating Washington, but succumbing to LSU. I think that LSU loss in 2018 did a lot more damage to the Auburn Tigers that a lot of folks would really care to realize. You talk about a very, very huge loss, and you talk about the game of inches nature in college football. You talk about a 1-point win for Auburn versus a 1-point loss, and how that swing the trajectory of that season is just really, really phenomenal how that happened. Now, we talk about Mississippi State, for example, going into the 2019 season. They got a lot of folks to replace, some very key players, in my opinion, to replace. In especially talking about having to replace Nick Fitzgerald. That was pretty much a mainstay as far as stability at the quarterback position. And, going to be incredibly difficult to replace a guy like him and what he meant to the Mississippi State Bulldogs. And see, here's the thing. Nick Fitzgerald in that game against Auburn last year really imposed his will on the Tigers, especially after the fact that Auburn could not get anything going offensively. Auburn had an opportunity to, make some things happen early, had some turnovers early, but didn't take advantage of those opportunities. I think probably the most crucial play of that game was Boobie Whitlow fumbling just at the inch line, and that play actually being turned over in Mississippi State's favor. That was pretty much the beginning of the end of Auburn in that particular game. So, with Nick Fitzgerald being gone, you talk about having to depend on K'Tion Thompson at the quarterback position. Mississippi State still has Kylan Hill, who actually had a pretty good game against Auburn last year. They have a pretty solid offensive line returning, as well as that, that center Darrell Williams will be anchoring as well. Mississippi State definitely will still have that stout defensive line, also anchored on the defense with Errol Thompson. I really think that Mississippi State is going to have a pretty good football team this year. Should they beat Auburn based on the talent level that Auburn has, for the first time being too deep pretty much in most of the key positions on the football field outside of the offensive line, I think the experience factor will play. Also, they will be playing in Jordan Hare Stadium, which is a very difficult place for opposing teams to play. You can bring the best that you have to offer, and Jordan Hare Stadium is not necessarily green pastures for you. We're going to look out for this Mississippi State game. It's always a pivotal game for the Auburn Tigers. I think will be a very strong litmus test as far as how the stretch will go for the Tigers. Moorhead in his second year as a head coach, really starting to piece together his program, and the trip to Auburn will be very, very daunting, perhaps for him, because Auburn plays very well at home, especially at night. We don't know whether this is going to be one of those 12 o'clock games or not. They're going to be facing Auburn right after Auburn has the test against Texas A&M. Excuse me. But Mississippi State has the opportunity to really be successful in 2019, but I don't think they're going to have much success against this very, very potent Auburn offense and very, very stout Auburn defense. Once again, it's Kennard Vernon Stewart for Vernon Speaks Sports Auburn, talking a little Auburn football today, preview on the Mississippi State game this year. Always a pivotal point of the season for the Tigers. As always, on this channel, it's great to be an Auburn Tiger. On the plains of Auburn, the battle cry is War Eagle. You all take care.